Happy New Year, Second Chances, Book 4. Written by Jason Ayres, narrated by Aisling Leyne, produced by Torrid Star Productions. Chapter 1. 2016. I've really grown to hate New Year. What do I hate so much about it? Pretty much everything, if I'm honest. And that was even before I got stuck in this time loop. Now I'm living every depressing detail of each and every one of them all over again. Where do I start? Well, the biggest problem is it's my birthday. I was born on 1st of January 1986, which makes me 39 years old. Or at least I was, before all this time-travelling business started. People say I look younger, men mostly, who are trying to get me into bed. That isn't meant to sound bitter. It's just the voice of experience from one who's been there, done it, and bought and thrown away the T-shirt as far as men are concerned. Or one man in particular, if truth be told. But more about him later. If I'm being brutally honest, and hopefully reasonably modest, until recently when I looked in the mirror, I would say I could pass for 35. That's not first thing in the morning, obviously, but no one looks great at that time of day unless they're in a movie waking up after a night of improbably romantic sex. I'm talking at least an hour after I've woken up, when I've washed, moisturised and had 2 cups of coffee to make me feel human again. Oh, and I've done my hair. Unlike those Hollywood starlets, I don't have my own personal stylist to make my hair look perfect while I'm asleep. Despite its bedraggled early morning look, my best feature probably is my hair. It's long, blonde, and without a hint of grey in sight. Before she died, I remember my mother telling me that grey hairs will start showing up when I hit 40. With all that's been happening to me lately, I'm not sure I will ever reach that milestone. You see, I don't have to pass for being 35 anymore because, as of today, I'm only 30. In 2 days' time, I'll turn 29. Confused yet? I sure as hell was when all this started happening. That was about 3 weeks ago. Since when, it's been permanently New Year, which, you'll recall, is not my favourite time of year. 1st of January must be a strong contender for the worst possible date on which to have a birthday. Only 25th of December could possibly trump it. There was a girl I went to school with in Liverpool who was born on Christmas Day. Siobhan had really mean grandparents who always bought her a joint birthday and Christmas present, which was a pretty flimsy excuse for getting away with buying just one. It wasn't as if they even spent twice the money. She would get a cheap Tamagotchi off the Heritage Market at Stanley Dock if she was lucky. I didn't mind being born on 1st of January when I was still a child. Apparently everyone made a real fuss of me when I was born because I was the first baby born at Liverpool Women's Hospital in 1986. I was supposed to have been born the previous day, but clung on to me mother's womb until 12 minutes after midnight. Being the first meant I even got my picture in the Echo. It was my first and last moment of fame. I've not appeared in a newspaper since. As I grew up, being born on 1st of January still seemed like a good thing. I'd never had to go to school on my birthday, and because it was a bank holiday, there were always plenty of family members around to celebrate. Some years we would go and visit my maternal grandparents in Oxford. On others, they would come and stay with us. These were the happiest years before me mum and dad split. After that, I started being dragged from one end of the country to the other, losing some of my sense of identity in the process. From that point, my birthday celebrations took a nosedive. By the time I hit my late teens and early 20s and wanted to go out drinking and partying to celebrate my birthday, nobody was interested. They were always too hungover from the night before. "I can't see what the problem is," said Kelly, who was my best friend at the time. "I think you're lucky. The whole country goes out to celebrate your birthday. Blatantly they didn't, but I couldn't be bothered to point out the flaws in that argument, so I just went along with it. I knew that me friends weren't really celebrating me birthday, even if they could be bothered to pretend they were. They, like everyone else, went out to enjoy New Year's Eve. It was only when Big Ben chimed that my birthday celebrations could truly begin, and invariably they didn't. Everyone always wished me Happy New Year, but hardly anyone ever said Happy Birthday. In their drunken euphoria, they had forgotten all about me. Going out to celebrate my birthday? I think not. Let's go out for lunch on my actual birthday, tomorrow, I suggested one year, not long after Big Ben chimed. Of course, everyone was up for it in their drunken state. The following lunchtime, I sat like a total numpty in Nando's, like some Billy No-Mates, realisation slowly dawning that no one was going to turn up. Not one of them even bothered to text. Most were probably still in bed. Even an extra large dollop of peri-peri sauce couldn't state my disappointment. After I turned 30, birthdays became less of a big deal. I felt less inclined to go out and get drunk every year like I had before. I was working full-time as a nurse by then, and the enhanced pay for working over the bank holiday period was well worth missing yet another tedious New Year's Eve party for. It was enough to pay for a nice week away in the Canaries in January, just as everyone else was struggling back to work. I loved going on holiday at that time of year. It was cheap as chips outside the school holidays. I felt sorry for people with kids when I looked at the astronomical prices travel agents charged during the school holidays. How did they ever afford to get away? I was determined to make the most of the years before I had children to travel as much as possible. But to be honest, a week each year in Lanzarote wasn't exactly travelling the world as I had in my younger years. I would go with Rob, my ex, and we always got on better when we went away. In the latter years, it was about the only time we communicated at all. But as I later discovered, he had other distractions back home. I didn't work every New Year. Of those I did not, I could honestly say I had only had one decent birthday in the past decade. That was last year, when my two eager young flatmates actually pushed the boat out and made the effort for me. Prior to that, virtually every other birthday in my 30s had been a non-event. Rob, whom I lived with for several years, never seemed bothered about me working during the holiday period. Since he was shagging the girl next door behind me back for at least half of the time we were living together, I guess he saw it as an opportunity for a little extracurricular activity. It was actually on my birthday 4 years ago when he dropped the bombshell he was leaving me for her. You might be thinking that was rather heartless. Could he not at least have waited until the day after? Actually, he couldn't, as it was on that particular day I caught the pair of them in bed together. Would he ever have told me if I hadn't stumbled on them as I had? Would I have lived with him another 4 years in blissful ignorance? I only found out then after coming home early from work because I was poorly. Yes, I had a terrible cold as well. Just one more thing to make the misery of that day complete. It was definitely one of my all-time worst New Year's, and I've had some shockers, believe me. Aside from my own personal issues, there's one other thing I really detest about New Year, and that's all the false hope and bravado that people come out with. This year's gonna be my year, they say. It's time for a fresh start, they proclaim. Then they carry right on making all the same mistakes they did the previous year, while unrealistically expecting different results. You would think they'd learn from experience, but most never do. So it's the same dead-end jobs, same bad boyfriends, same drink, drugs and bad food. It's annoying enough when they go on about it to your face, but it's even worse when it's plastered all over Facebook. Some seem to regurgitate almost word for word exactly the same rubbish they spouted the previous year and the year before that. I don't know why they don't just cut and paste it and be done with it. Some of them boldly declare their resolutions, but what's the point? They never keep them, and why tell all and sundry about it via social media? They're only setting themselves up to look foolish and weak-willed when it all goes pear-shaped. There's one girl I used to work with who has a long history of choosing inappropriate men. Basically, she's addicted to bad boys. When they crap all over her, all we hear is all men are bastards and get the big victim act. A couple of weeks later, it all goes quiet as she starts screwing the next one, who of course is a carbon copy of the previous one, but none of this is her fault, of course. Last New Year, she pronounced on Facebook that she was finished with men for good. Last I heard, she was pregnant by a guy she met in February who has kids by 4 different women and has since been done for GBH. Another friend and current colleague claims to be a size 18 but is actually nearer 26. She starts Weight Watchers every January, and wow, do we get to hear all about it. Constantly. We get daily updates for a few weeks of how well she's doing, and then it all goes strangely quiet. This is around the time the lure of the cream cakes becomes too much. This resolution, fresh start stuff is basically just complete bollocks. Forlorn hopes, shallow promises. The whole thing is just so forced and false. 2nd of January is probably my favourite day of the year due to the relief of it being all over. The first thing I do on that day is to get the Christmas tree down and remove all evidence of the festivities from the house. My flatmates sometimes complain that it's bad luck, but I can't understand people who keep that stuff up till 12th night. Who honestly still feels Christmassy looking at tinsel and lights on 5th of January? Once it's all gone, my home looks refreshingly bare and normality can resume. Or at least, that used to be the case. Because for me, normality no longer exists. It seems that I'm stuck permanently with New Year for the rest of my life, which by my calculations is not long. I guess it's high time I explained what the hell I'm talking about. Well, it kinda goes like this. Chapter 2. 2025. When it first happened, I was confused to begin with, almost amnesiac. But now I can recall in great detail everything that occurred on that day. After the initial period of disorientation and shock, my mind cleared, and now I've been over the events that occurred hundreds of times. I thought if I analysed it in that much detail, I might eventually pick up some clue that might help me form a plan to get me out of this predicament. So far, I've drawn a blank. It was 1st of January 2025, just another bog-standard New Year's Day. There was nothing remarkable about it, other than it being my birthday, and you already know how I feel about that. It was a particularly significant birthday for me, but before you ask, it wasn't the big 3-0 or 4-0. Everyone makes a big deal about them, but they don't bother me. It's the birthdays that end in a 9 that I've grown to dread. For the record, this particular one was my 39th. I think turning 39 is worse than turning 40, because it's like someone's put up a great glaring neon sign highlighting the fact that the big one is only a year away. I went through the same thing on my 29th. During that birthday, and for most of the following year, I was hugely aware of the giant sword hanging over my head, with the imaginary voice of the executioner bellowing at me over and over, "You're nearly 30, you're not young anymore, it's all downhill from here." So depressing was the thought that at times I felt he may as well chop my head off and be done with it. I remembered watching some old sci-fi movie when I was a kid, when society did exactly that. kill everyone off at the age of 30. On my gloomier days, it seemed like a perfectly sensible idea. By the time 30 actually did roll around, I'd had a whole year to come to terms with the situation, so the day itself was not too bad after all. It was one of those few birthdays I had enjoyed since becoming an adult. Rob was exceptionally attentive by his standards. Looking back, it was possibly the last year before he'd started knocking off the neighbour, because after that, he basically didn't bother. Once I had settled into my 30s, I came to quite enjoy them. The whole decade stretched out in front of me, seemingly full of possibilities, which at that time included the very realistic prospect of marriage and babies. I came to realise that 30 was no age at all, not in the modern world. Then the years flew by, and suddenly here I was hitting 39 and another sword hanging over me head. This time the terrifying prospect of being 40 was looming on the horizon. That was practically middle-aged. And I thought back to when I was 29 and how worried I'd been about that. It all seemed quite laughable now. I hadn't been much more than a kid, really. Now I was about to hit 40, and what had I achieved in the past decade? Diddly squat, that's what. I'd gone backwards, if anything. I still had the same job, but not the same boyfriend who I foolishly had believed might want to marry me and be the father of me babies. Now I didn't have a boyfriend at all. My sex life was laughably non-existent, confined to my own solitary fumbling over countless unfulfilled fantasies and missed opportunities. As for my biological clock, that wasn't so much ticking as booming out like Big Ben's bongs as they heralded the dawn of yet another year. Under the circumstances, there was no way I was making even a token effort to celebrate the dawn of the final year of my 4th decade. Some people were making a big deal out of it being the end of the first quarter of the century. Where had all that time gone? It seemed like the millennium had only just happened. It was all so depressing that when the holiday period roster was being drawn up at work, I was first to put my name down. Working 4 nights in a row was no sweat to me. I did it all the time. What did it matter? Without kids or a partner, it wasn't as if I was missing any quality time with anyone. New Year wasn't the most pleasant time to be working in the hospital, but with all the consolation of a week in Lanzarote just over a week away, I wasn't particularly bothered. It wasn't as if I was in A&E or anything. Working in there on New Year's Eve was, by all accounts, a nightmare. Up on the wards, we just picked up the fallouts. Some of those admitted through A&E found their way up to me. Many of them were the worse for wear due to drink, either imbibing too much of it or being assaulted by someone else who had. It was like this most weekends, so I was used to it. But at New Year, you could double it and then some. The first such individuals didn't even wait until New Year. A particularly unpleasant man who'd nearly lost an eye in a pub brawl on the 30th. He was under the impression that swearing at the nurses was a good way to get what he wanted, as he swiftly found out it was not. He was typical of the drunks we got in there from time to time, who seemed to think it was acceptable to get lippy with us. It was something I just wouldn't stand for. Having a go with people in the pub is bad enough, but abusing the trained healthcare professional trying to patch them back together was way beyond out of order. It wasn't unheard of for those dregs of humanity to even assault the staff, and following an incident the previous year, we'd had panic buttons installed on all the wards. Working for the NHS could be a thankless task at times, but, as they say, somebody's got to do it. In my early years in nursing, I found these drunken, leery arseholes intimidating. But over the years, I'd learned to give as good as I got. Anyone trying to backchat me soon got put in their place, and there was very little they could say that would faze me. What did affect me was the other type of patient we saw more at this time of the year than any other. I'm talking about the suicide cases. Those poor, desperate souls who, for whatever reason, can't find the strength in themselves to face another year. It certainly puts my trivial New Year woes into perspective. Thankfully, up in the wards, I usually only get to see the survivors. If they make it as far as us, the vast majority do live to tell the tale. But I'm well aware that there are plenty more out there who won't be found in time. This particular New Year's Eve had featured examples of both types of cases. It was the third of my 4 nights, and by dawn we had 4 new patients on the ward. One with alcohol poisoning, another who'd been glassed in a fight in a pub, the second such case in as many nights, and another who'd been beaten to a pulp in an argument over whose turn it was in a taxi rank. The fourth was a single mother in her late 20s who had taken an overdose of painkillers. What had driven her to do that, I didn't know at this stage, but I hoped I'd find out when she woke up. I took a tough line with the drunks and the other idiots, but I could be equally tender with those who needed it. If I got the chance to talk with this girl the next day, I'd do whatever I could to help her through her pain. A tender hand was also needed for those who invariably came to us in the final days of their lives. We had one such patient on the ward for the past few days, a middle-aged man who was on the verge of succumbing, like so many before him, to the ravages of lung cancer. I'd grown to like Thomas Scott. Despite his terminal state of health, he had maintained his dignity and even a sense of humour, joking and even flirting with me a little as I cared for him. As the end neared, I felt increasingly sorry for Thomas. He was only in his 50s, which was far too young to die. His daughter Stacey, a lovely and compassionate woman, came in to see him every day. She was clearly devoted to her father, and stripping up a conversation with her, I found out that there'd been a fair amount of tragedy in her life. Her mother had been killed by a drink driver years before, and now she was about to become an orphan in her 20s. She too needed comfort, perhaps more so than Thomas, who'd seemed to have accepted his fate. I was more than happy to be a shoulder to cry on, reflecting that it wasn't just the patients that needed help sometimes, it was also those closest to them. Some of my colleagues were of the opinion that we should keep a professional distance from our patients, including their nearest and dearest, but I didn't agree. This wasn't a production line in a factory. We were dealing with living, feeling human beings. Just by being in hospital, they were in many cases going through some of the most traumatic moments of their lives, dying or otherwise. I'd come into caring after witnessing death and misery on a wide scale in my youth after a natural disaster. I had realised then that what I wanted to do was care for those in need. If I was detached from people's emotional needs, then what was the point? I might as well go and stack shelves in Tesco. I did a lot of caring that last normal day. Just before I got off shift in the morning, I spent some time with Casey, the girl who had tried to take her own life during the Hogmanay celebrations. It came as no surprise to hear it was all over a man, who in this case had turned out to be a really nasty piece of work. Over the course of about half an hour, she related the whole grisly tale to me. It seemed that she had been muddling along as a single mum until a couple of years ago, until this lad, Aaron, had come into her life and swept her off her feet. But he hadn't been all he had appeared to be. He had been a drug dealer and a criminal who had gradually taken over her life, seducing her with money and glamour before hooking her on drugs so that he could control her. He also used her flat to store his merchandise, and when she eventually got raided following a tip-off, it was her, rather than him, that the police arrested. With threats of violence if she implicated him, Casey ended up in court and fined. But it didn't end there. In financial mess and drug-dependent, she had come to the attention of social services. Ultimately, her 3-year-old daughter was taken away. That had been the final nail in the coffin that had driven her to the overdose. Aaron, of course, was long gone by this time, having moved on to his next victim. I tried to empathise with her situation as best I could, but my suffering at the hands of my unfaithful man was trivial compared to what she'd been through. Remembering the heartbreak I'd been through at New Year 4 years ago, I could scarcely begin to imagine the extent of her pain. I wanted to tell her it would get easier, but would it? She had pretty much lost everything. All I could do was console her and offer her advice on how to get her daughter back, which had to be the number one priority. After a few hours' sleep, I came back into work on the evening of 1st of January for the last of my 4 nights. It turned out it was to be my last night in a way which I was completely unaware of yet. During this final shift, my world was going to be turned upside down. On my return, I discovered that Thomas Scott was in a bad way. He was unconscious and near death. The strange events that were to change my life were destined to occur in his private room, which was just off the main ward. It was paid for by the private healthcare he'd received as part of his pension package. Apparently he'd had quite a stellar career in retail trade and had retired early, clearly not short of a few quid. This was all information I had gleaned from one of my many chats with Stacey over the previous few days. Talking about her dad seemed to help her deal with what she was going through. The last time I had spoken to Thomas himself had been on the morning of the 30th, just before I went off shift. He had been struggling that day, seemingly forgetful of who he was or why he was in hospital. Subsequently, he had gone quickly downhill. By the time I came into work on the evening of the 1st of January, it was clear he was not going to last the night. The end came in the early hours of the following morning. I'd been caring for him during the previous few hours, but had gone for a break when the inevitable happened. It was left to my colleague Carmen to give me the sad news when she returned to the break room. "I'm afraid Mr. Scott has passed away," she said. Some people think that we nurses become anaesthetised to such sad news, dealing with it every day. But I never did, and felt very sorry for Thomas and his family. He'd been a decent guy. "Did he regain consciousness at all?" I asked. "He woke up briefly," replied Carmen. "He wasn't alone. His daughter was with him." The task of preparing the body to be taken down to the mortuary fell to me. This was one part of the job in nursing that I never felt fully prepared for, no matter how many times I did it. On the way to Thomas's room, I passed Stacey and her fiancé David. She looked at me, tear-stained face full of grief. She let go of David and hugged me. "It's okay," I said as I held her, even though of course it wasn't. Nothing could take away the pain of what she had just been through. But if I could offer even the slightest crumb of comfort, just from the warmth of human contact, then I'd helped, albeit in a small way. I approached Thomas's room, steeling myself for the sad task that lay ahead. The first thing I would do when I got into the room would be to open the window, even though it was freezing outside. This was a nursing tradition that had been taught to me in my early days by an older nurse who I'd worked with in Africa with the Red Cross. She was a committed Christian and had claimed that it would help to set the deceased spirit free. Although I wasn't much of a believer in the afterlife myself, it had stuck with me and it always felt like the right thing to do. Next, I would begin the process of laying out the body. I would wash the patient from head to toe and then dress him or her in fresh linen prior to the body being taken down to the morgue. As I went about this, I always treated the dead patient with the utmost respect, speaking gently to them as if they were still alive. At odds with my general atheist nature, at those moments, there was always a small part of me that imagined that some small spark of consciousness might still exist somewhere. If that were true, then hopefully my words of comfort might help them along their journey to wherever they believed they might be going. Or maybe I was just doing it to help me cope better with the task in hand. Either way, it worked for me. I was not destined to even get started on these tasks this time. As I opened the door to the private room, I was taken aback to see a very oddly dressed stranger inside, peering intently at the chart at the bottom of Thomas's bed. He was dressed in outdoor clothing, but with an old-fashioned medical white coat draped over the top. If this was some attempt to disguise himself as a doctor, it was a pretty lame one, particularly as he was also wearing a large hiker's rucksack over the top of the coat. My first thought on seeing the rucksack was of terrorism. It was a reaction I always had now when I saw anyone acting even slightly out of the ordinary wearing a rucksack. It was an irrational fear brought on by decades of terrorist attacks in London and elsewhere. This man didn't look like your average terrorist, whatever that was. I suppose my fears had conditioned me to imagine some young man of Middle Eastern origin. This was prejudice, I know, but its too many images in the media had imprinted this cliché indelibly on my mind. This man was white and middle-aged, in his early 50s at a guess. Not only did he not look like a terrorist, but also it was illogical to think that he might be. Why would anyone want to blow up an empty hospital room with nothing but a dead body and a cheap plastic Christmas tree in it? Whoever he was, he ought not to be there, and I had no hesitation in challenging him. "Who are you?" I demanded, determined not to show any fear despite the distinctly uneasy feeling flooding through my body. "What are you doing in here?" "I'm Dr. Gardner," he said in a ludicrously posh accent that just had to be put on as he cast his gaze down at me name badge. "I'm a specialist visiting from Harley Street. I'm delighted to meet you, Amy." I wasn't convinced for a moment by his overblown acting. Who did he think he was? Hugh Grant? I was also not impressed by him ogling my breasts during his laughably poor performance. "Don't give me that," I replied, "and stop staring at me tits. None of the doctors in this hospital or anywhere else wear white coats anymore. What they do wear is ID. So where's yours?" "Ah, yes. One of the chaps down on security was going to print one off for me earlier this evening," he ventured. "I must pop down and pick it up at some point." I just looked at him with a face that said, "Really?" I didn't even have to utter the word. He could see I didn't believe a word of it and changed tack. "Look, I'll come clean," he said, reverting to a normal accent. "I'm not a doctor. I'm a scientist attached to the university, carrying out some research here. I just need a couple of minutes, that's all. Then I'll be out of your hair." Was he telling the truth? With his backpack, along with waving a strange metal wand-like device around in front of him, I guess he could pass for a scientist, but not in a lucid and bona fide one. He looked more like some crazy character from a sci-fi movie. All he was lacking was the wild Einstein-style hair. A more likely explanation was that he was some sort of escaped mental patient, and if that was the case, I could well be in danger. Mindful of last year's incident on the ward, I decided the best course of action was to call for some help. "I'm sorry, but that's just not good enough," I replied. "People don't go round hospitals in the middle of the night wearing dubious disguises unless they're up to no good." "What can I get up to in here?" protested the fake Dr. Gardner, gesturing towards the body on the bed. "It's not as if I've come to bump him off, is it? It's a bit late for that. The Grim Reaper's already been and gone." "I'm calling security," I replied, moving towards the telephone on the wall beside the door. "No, don't do that," he protested and began to move to cut me off. This was all the provocation I needed. Issuing a silent prayer of thanks for the recently improved security measures, I headed for the panic button on the wall behind the bed instead, reaching it just before he was able to stop me. His attempt to block my path had been more than a little unsettling. I really hoped that whoever was on security was paying attention and not snoozing on the job. Dr. Gardner, if that was his real name, backed off once he saw the flashing red button on the wall. "Since when have hospitals had panic buttons?" he asked, looking unsettled. He was on the back foot all of a sudden, which gave me a chance to seize the initiative. I had no intention of showing him any weakness, so, keeping my voice as level as I could, I spelt out the situation in black and white. "Since last year, when a patient assaulted a nurse on this very ward," I replied. "Do you have any idea how much abuse we get from drunks that get hauled in here every weekend? Now you've got less than 2 minutes until security arrives from downstairs to escort you from the premises, and that won't be pleasant. They don't take too kindly to women being threatened and can get quite heavy-handed. If I were you, I'd scarp her now while you still can." This was a blatant lie. The agent head of security, Barry, spent the vast majority of his time sitting in his office drinking tea and eating biscuits. He hadn't seen any action since his army days, decades in the past. Most of his colleagues were no better, but this stranger wasn't to know that. "Fine," he said, "but I'll be back and you won't even know about it." I assumed that meant he was going to leave, but he didn't show any signs of departing by the traditional method, i.e. the door. Instead, he pointed his weird device in front of him and started pressing buttons on it. It was the first time I'd seen it, and it looked like something out of Doctor Who. "What are you doing?" I asked, becoming increasingly convinced that this was some kind of nutter. "Nothing for you to worry about," was his reply. This man had seriously lost the plot. What did he think he was going to do? Teleport out of there with his homemade remote-controlled TV aerial? Ironically outlandish as that idea had seemed at the time, given what happened next, I may not have been far off the mark, because this was the moment when the weird sci-fi shit started happening, leading me to realise that he was more than just a weirdo after all. Of course, it was too late to do anything about it by then. I was caught up in whatever was going on, and it was too late to avoid it. I was well and truly over my event horizon. What happened was all over very quickly. Suddenly there seemed to be two of them in the room, the second one seemingly appearing out of nowhere. He hadn't come through the door, that was for sure, as I would have seen him from where I was standing. The other version looked exactly the same, right down to the white coat. Could there be twins? Or was this some kind of visual trickery? There was no time to figure it out, as something else was already happening. They had both been pointing their wands across the room, close to Thomas's bed. Then I heard a long, drawn-out cry of "No!" from one or possibly both of the men, in the style of some over-dramatic movie scene. I might have found this amusing if I'd been watching from afar rather than being an unwilling participant. Then everything descended into a kaleidoscopic, whirling maelstrom of colour and noise. As multiple mirror images of myself, the stranger, and the body on the bed swirled all around me, I felt myself being sucked by a hugely powerful force towards the centre of the room. Like a spider in a bathtub being drawn towards the plug hole, I flayed my arms helplessly, completely powerless to escape. It was the last thing I remembered before I blacked out. And that is how all of this began.